What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome. We're back. Todd Kent, Kirby Goodell here with Inside Political Science, back with another great episode. And we have a special guest. One of the great things, Todd, about being in the field and the work that we're in, we interact with a lot of really smart, incredibly talented people. And we have with us today Brandon Rottinghaus. He's a professor at the University of Houston. He got his PhD at Northwestern University. He's a Purdue undergrad, which interesting. And also the author of several great books, including Inside Texas Politics, now I think in its fourth edition. Also The Professional Pulpit, Modern Presidential Leadership of Public Opinion. And along with our own graduate, Justin Vaughn, who has also been a guest on the episode. He is in charge of the Presidential Greatness Project. So we just have so much to talk about, and we're excited about it. Welcome, and we're so glad you're here to join us.
Hey, Kirby, Todd, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you here. As usual, there's a lot to talk about. So we're very excited that you're here, and I think your background is perfect for, I think, our listeners.
Yeah, and we thought, because there's, like I said, we really want to talk about presidential politics. We really want to talk about Texas politics. We thought we'd jump in with the Texas politics because you are one of the leading experts in this area. You have, like I said, you got a great book on it. And we're in the midst of a legislative session, lots of stuff going on. And with the legislative session, Governor Abbott has identified his emergency items, but they're not really emergencies. Right? They're priorities.
It depends on how you ask, and who you ask. But obviously, these are emergencies in the sense that they have to be dealt with today. But because of the way the Constitution's written, these like emergency items allow the legislature to get a jump start. You know, the leg only meets once every 2 years for 140 days, but realistically, they're meeting about 90 days when you take out all of the kind of limitations in terms of how they can act. So this is really kind of just the governor firing the starting gun, letting them get started. But yeah, his agenda is pretty bold. I will say that it's kind of a familiar agenda. These are things that, you know, he and the Republicans have been fighting about with Democrats and amongst themselves for several years now. But basically, the kind of core elements of these are going to be pretty spendy. You're talking about water issues, which could range into the billions, infrastructure issues, which definitely have the big price tag. He's proposed significant tax cuts. That's going to have a pretty hefty price tag that is in addition to the price tag that is already from the past tax cuts they've paid. So there's just a lot of money that's going to have to go out here. This state's budget's booming. I mean, they've got a lot of money, but the problem is that they may not always have a lot of money. And, you know, we've kind of been around here long enough to have seen these budget cycles come and go. They budget on a 2-year budget, which means that it's hard to kind of understand what's going to happen in 2 years. It could be economic downturn, the price of oil, could be another kind of pandemic or something like that. So there's definitely kind of a lot of unknowns right now. If you look at the way the controller has talked about the revenue that's shaping up Texas's next budget, it's pretty flat. Sales taxes are pretty flat. Overall revenue is pretty flat. So Texas is booming, and, you know, you see it everywhere. Grocery stores, you know, the Costco is totally jam full and the highways are, you know, full of people, but the state really may be in a position where the growth is cooling. And that could be a problem if you've got these big ticket items you're going to have to pay for, you know, in perpetuity.
So thinking about the governor and his attitude towards higher education, what do you see on the horizon? I think a lot of our listeners are interested in the state legislature and higher education funding.
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric about higher ed and kind of what happens and the ways that it happens. Some of it's overblown, you know, and some of it could be reformed. It's just something that is a useful punching bag for a lot of people. I think that becomes kind of complicated, you know, in this discussion. So the fact is, though, that, you know, everybody's incentives here are to have higher ed succeed. And the governor has talked about expanding the number of tier one universities, adding money to places like Texas State and North Texas. UH has sort of been in this mix for a while, and they've been pressing for that. So there's definitely I think a need to have Texas universities compete with places like California and New York. They've got to keep their students here. They've got to be attracting workers. They've got to be, kind of continuing to bring in these businesses to be able to harness the skilled workforce. So there's a real incentive, I think, to kind of really build education in Texas, but it's expensive. These things aren't cheap. And although obviously, there are ways you could kind of trim things here and there, the fact is that if you look at, secondary education and higher education together, it's a pretty substantial portion of the budget, and how that gets funded is definitely going to be something that we're going to hear a lot about in the session.
Yeah, and one of the things talking about higher ed is and staying on that just a little bit is it does seem like a lot of times when you look at the proposals coming into the legislature, some of the ones that are anti higher ed get lots of play, but then at the end of the session you go, oh, we didn't do that bad. Right? We came out pretty well. Maybe we shouldn't tell anyone that. Maybe we shouldn't say that. Maybe that will alert people that we're doing pretty well. We don't want them to know. But it does seem like, to your point, that everyone in Texas seems pretty well committed to the idea. They understand that we have great universities and that those great universities need to be supported.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And everybody recognizes that Texas is going to continue to grow. It's got to continue to bring in these outside businesses. That's the way the structure of the budget is set. Sales tax is a huge portion of this. The industry tax, the business tax is sort of a smaller portion of it that's been shrinking over the years, but that's another big feature of it. We need people to buy cars. We need people to buy gas. These are all elements that basically, kind of really drive the state's economic engine. So these things are all really connected to it. But I mean, your point, I think, is well taken, that you've got a lot of these bills that are just messaging bills. They're not going to see the light of day. And most kind of, individuals in the legislature look at these and say, like, it's not worth fighting about this, right? There's too many other things to fight about. So they're going to kind of pick and choose their battles. And, there's going to be a lot. Republicans are fighting about vouchers. They're fighting internally about how to structure tax cuts. House and Senate are at odds about, speed in terms of how to move legislation through, but also kind of just the ideological tilt of the whole thing. The governor, generally speaking, tries to referee a little bit, but whoever is on the governor's side is going to have an edge. And at this point, it looks like from last session to this one, that the Senate is really kind of driving that. So we're going to see how all these kind of fights play out. There's a possibility of a special session. The 140 days is not very long, and a lot of Republicans are complaining now that even that time is not well spent, that they should not be doing things like having these ceremonial, kind of proclamations about Beyonce. They should, be kind of legislating. There's a lot of time for that, and that'll definitely be something that we'll see. But there's certainly internal dissent about how much to do and how quickly to do it.
I'm going to steal a question that Kirby proposed to me earlier, and that is, given what you just said about the current state of Texas politics and the governor, what are you looking for in the future is the profile of the governor moving forward towards future elections and that type of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Texas has a long history of kind of promoting its politicians to national offices. I wrote a book last year, or finished a book last year on Rick Perry. And so looking at the kind of history of Governor Perry and the way the Republican Party shifted, you can definitely see how sometimes translating your efforts on a local statewide level to a national level can be really hard. Governor Perry ran the roost in Texas. No one was going to stop him. Even inter-party challenges didn't go anywhere in primaries. But by the time he got to the national stage, there was a lot of other competition. And the way he talked about party politics, it was the case that people, had moved on. The Republican Party had drifted to the right. And so he didn't look like he was sort of in the mainstream of the party anymore. And some of the proposals he put out there just didn't sell. Perry was like that. He got, pretty big for his boots. And I think they kind of overestimated what they thought was going to happen. That's certainly documented in my book. And so Abbott has the same problem. I mean, what you do on the state level can be pretty useful, and you can definitely move the needle on these policy issues. But sometimes it's hard to translate that in a direct way. I think that Abbott has seen this, though, and probably will have a smoother transition to a national storyline than Perry did. But the politics are very different from then to now. So honestly, it's really anybody's guess. I mean, if you look at the history of kind of Governor Abbott's success in Congress or success in the legislature, one of the things you find is that he's been steadily increasing the percentage of his wins. So from his first session, he's getting about 80% of his stuff passed, to compare to last session, the 2023 session, the 87th or 88th session, he was getting about 88%. So he's definitely kind of moving the needle, but he's also shrinking his agenda. The State of the State last week, he had, and I counted, like 25 different items. 7 of them were these priority items. So that's a big agenda to get passed. And generally speaking, he's probably going to get most of this, since it tends to correspond with the success of Republicans in office. But, he's got to get some wins. He's got to make sure he follows through on these things. And like all governors, he's got to have a signature win. One of the things I asked Governor Perry was, kind of what to you is your signature win? What's the big issue here? You have to read the book to find out what he said. But one of the things that struck me was that that's the way governors think. They want to have a signature issue. They can go to the voters and say, this is the issue that I wanted. I proposed it. You all adjudicated it, voted me into office, and I got it passed. That's probably vouchers. That's definitely going to be something they debate. I'm guessing it'll pass in some form, but if it doesn't get enough movement on a national scale, then it's not going to be a successful outcome for Abbott. He's behind the curve a little, right? Places like Arizona, Iowa have already moved ahead on vouchers, Florida too. So he's going to be kind of on the drag on this, I think, which could be problematic for him on a national scale. The last thing I'll say is that if you look at the kind of polling in terms of kind of national, kind of public figures, he never even registers. I mean, he's in single digits and sometimes doesn't even appear. And so it's hard to kind of see him breaking in an instant way, but 4 years is a long, long time. And obviously, everybody's going to reshuffle things once Donald Trump is gone. So yeah, lots to think about.
Yeah, he does seem to be building, though, this profile. I mean, you sort of look at the checklist of items and you're saying, oh yeah, cut taxes. School vouchers, already sort of, he's got the record on the border of especially without Trump there, where he was sort of the focal point of border politics and the shipping of immigrants to other states, other cities, really trying to keep the issue high profile and helping his party that way. So when you look at sort of the checklist of issues, he looks like he's building a presidential resume, and then he's a really good fundraiser. He looks like he's learned the politics much better, as you said, kind of as he's moved across the course of his term. He went from sort of kind of low profile for a governor to much more high profile. I think still nationally his profile is, as you said, he's not registering a lot on that, but he is building that sort of record that you could easily see. This is someone who may be thinking about 2028.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's got to be, right. All Texas politicians do. Dave Carney, who was Perry's consultant for almost all of his years in office, is Governor Abbott's consultant too. And they've said that they don't plan to have this happen. That if it does happen, it'll be kind of a happenstance thing. I don't think that Abbott is running for governor. I think he's waiting for governor. And that means that, he's going to, try to be in the right place at the right time. And I think obviously politics is all about timing. So there's a good chance that he'll be in the mix. It's just one of those things. Like I said, the Texas politicians do the way that he is, and, the way they're wired definitely makes them think that way. And obviously too, yeah, I think the fundraising point is really good. He's surpassed all of Perry's fundraising records, with people did not think was going to get surpassed. One downside though is that he doesn't have the unity of the party that he sometimes you would assume he would have. There's a lot of dissent inside the party about kind of whether to trust him or not. And that's been, I think, a kind of limitation that he's going to find in this session. But he's going to get most of what he wants. I'd be surprised if he got less than 90% of all the items passed. Many of them are priorities that, Republicans have talked about for a while, but for sure it's the case that he's got to get some big wins and really brag about it to be able to make that next level.
When you talk about big wins, if I think back to George W. Bush and Karl Rove and their kind of the way they narrowed down the scope to just a few items when he was governor, and he worked tirelessly to make sure those happened. Is it a problem when you have 25 items on your agenda that nobody knows actually what you did?
I think that's a really good point. And the way I describe it is that, governors are smart to aim small and miss small. Like, you don't want to have this rangy target that you can't get because it makes it look like you're not able to accomplish your goals. Now, he's got a legislature that's more likely to back him now. He spent a lot of time and a lot of money, a lot of other people's money to campaign against incumbent Republicans who he didn't think were sufficiently on his side. This became a kind of major talking point since a lot of those Republicans were mostly on his side. The way he framed that they were against him was that they weren't supporting him on issues that they really had supported him on. So a lot of distrust was sown in that primary. And as a result, I think he definitely kind of lost some luster from the Republican Party. But at the end of the day, he got more or less what he wanted. I mean, he got, upwards of 17 new members who are willing to back him basically without even questioning it. So that's a plus for him and ultimately for his agenda.
Do you think that a voucher issue is a nationwide issue?
Yeah, it's a national issue. And like I said, I think, Texas is behind in that. Like, that is that there are these Republicans who are in these other states who are pressing this. Some of them have been problematic. If you look at Arizona in particular, they've got a $1.3 trillion deficit when it comes to spending on education because they've made these promises on vouchers. They're having to take money away from some of their water programs to put into spending on secondary education. That's not where Texas wants to be, especially because there is this sort of ongoing water crisis in the state that everyone acknowledges. So I do think that this is something that's going to be very high profile, very national, and it's also going to be very expensive. The good news is Texas has the money right now. The surplus is pretty thick. They've got about $20 billion that they didn't have before, and the tax receipts are solid, and so they're getting the money in the coffers more or less that they would need. But that is not something that we can count on forever. And like I said, there's a sort of sense that perhaps in the next biennium that things could slow down, and if the economy doesn't perform as well as expected, it could be a real issue. And, looking at the national scene, talking about Donald Trump and some of the trade wars that are likely to come in the next, few months to years, that could potentially slow down Texas's miracle. And that's really the harbinger of success politically for its politicians.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of division within the Republican Party, and from my perspective, when we were watching the speaker's race and the decision over the speaker, I'm like, wow, in terms of ideology, they look really similar to me. I'm not sure I completely understand what's going on here, but it does seem like, despite that there's that division, it looks like Abbott probably has sufficient support that he doesn't have to worry so much about support. Are there any out of that, are there any sort of divisions, factionalism that may become there are other ambitious politicians in the state who I think would love to be governor. Is there any possibility that the party splits going forward, or maybe if the trade war comes and it ends up weakening the Texas economy, is it conditional? Do you see? I mean, he looks pretty well situated for future governor runs if he wants them, or a future presidential run. Possibly, at least he's in position to think about it. Is there any divisions that you see, fractures that might open up over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's definitely friction inside the Republican Party, and some of them are just about personalities. There's this sense that the Republican Party's been co-opted by, these kind of plutocrats and billionaires who to tell the members what to do and how to vote. And they're really replacing Republicans Republicans say are just as good as a Republican as any other, as conservative. They vote the right way. They say the right things. They represent their district well. So a lot of members like Glenn Rogers, who got ousted, who represented part of Central Texas, that became a kind of rallying point for a lot of Republicans who said that it's unfair to get rid of some of these members who have really done everything they were asked to do, but did stand up for their district when it came to issues like the school choice issue. So those kinds of divides may be apparent, and I think you will see them on display. But my guess is that this session is going to be a pretty kind of comfortable session for Republicans. There was a lot of turmoil about, Dustin Burrows being too liberal. Like, what? It's just on its face wrong. And, we, of course, as political scientists track this, and there are all kinds of ways. Like my colleague Boris Shore spends a lot of time looking at the ideological positions of, these members across states. And obviously, there's divisions and there are differences, but more or less, they're all pretty conservative on the Republican side. So I think that Burrows sees what has to happen, and that's that he's got to have a pretty comfortable session. The real divide here, I think, isn't so much between the governor and the Republicans in the House or Senate, but rather between the House and the Senate. And it's really a question of Dan Patrick. And Patrick's priorities are, kind of set in stone. He released his priorities, at least his top 30 priorities that are, some of them personal, some of them ideologically driven. Many of them would be sort of things that the House would go for anyway, and that Governor Abbott would sign almost regardless. But it's the speed at which Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick wants to pursue it, and maybe just the emphasis on some of those issues that really is going to be the kind of decision point. Patrick wants the House to move faster. The House doesn't move that fast. It's constitutionally, in some cases, unable to do so, but it's also just a kind of institutional protection. They want to have control over their chamber, and they don't want Dan Patrick controlling their chamber too. Dan Patrick, just as an aside, has been the most consequential lieutenant governor in Texas history. Yeah. That has been apparent for a couple of sessions, but this is a pretty stunning change when you had people like Governor Perry, who, when he was lieutenant governor, just really try to find consensus. The split was much more kind of even between Republicans and Democrats. The rules required there to be a kind of consensus to move forward. A 2/3 rule had to be in effect, or was in effect, where those members had to mostly agree to pursue a kind of legislative course. So the rules changed because of Dan Patrick. The ideology of the Senate changed because of Dan Patrick, and he's basically controls at least that wing of the Capitol. So he wants it his way, and that's always been his approach, since he entered politics. He's not always going to get it, and that's going to lead to some friction. So that, to me, is kind of where the real kind of friction point is.
Well, maybe one last question on Texas politics, if you're up for it, and that is, what about the other side of the aisle? For years, we've been talking about, is Texas turning blue? Is it turning purple? Do Democrats have a chance to win the House? Do they have a chance to win a governor's race or a statewide race? Or maybe they running closer at the pres? Seems like maybe we won't be talking about that much.
Yeah. Who? It is a real conundrum for Democrats because they've been on the outside looking in for 30 years. And just as a tip of this, there are some really talented politicians in that mix. And I think they don't lack for people who could stand up to, Governor Abbott and, Dan Patrick, run against John Cornyn and do well. But they've just had bad luck in some cases. There are sort of strategic miscalculations in others, messaging problems that we've seen. Certainly that happened in the last cycle. But at the end of it is just money. They just don't have the resources to compete. And I talked to a reporter for my book on Perry, and one of the things he said was that if you can't get the money, then you can't get over that hill. You can't make a prima facie case that people are on your side and to convince them that your politics are right if you don't have the money to do it early and often. I think that's somewhat true, but we also saw Colin Allred, kind of not go on the road that much and spend most of his time, windowless offices making call time, which if you worked on campaigns like I have, then it's the most miserable thing. You sit there all day and just kind of, dial for dollars. And it's it's humiliating. It's sort of embarrassing. It's tedious. It's all the horrible things in campaigning that people don't like to do, but it's so important. And even having done that, he wasn't able to really move the needle against Ted Cruz. So that's all a long way of saying that this is still a state that's very red. The demographics have not led to to sort of political change the way that people would have wanted. The turnout in 24 was abysmal. I mean, as bad as we've seen in several cycles, as bad as we've seen in several midterm cycles, even though it was a presidential. So we could talk a lot about that. But I think the fact is that this is just a state that really is very red, and Democrats are struggling to find that message. I mean, there are a couple of examples of this. Number one, they switched their caucus chair. I mean, it changed from initially, it was a Chris Turner from years ago from North Texas, from Fort Worth, who was a kind of legislative tactician. They moved on Trey Martinez Fisher, who was a kind of knife fighter in terms of legal side of the legislative effect. And now they've changed to Gene Wu, who's just a partisan warrior. If you follow him on Twitter, he's just a bomb thrower. That gives you a sense of kind of where the Democrats are. They're going all in on just this sort of, kind of anti-Trump, anti-conservative strategy. And I don't know how well it will work. I mean, the goal for Democrats nationwide is likely going to be like, let's find a way to kind of talk to people where they are. I'm not sure Democrats are doing that yet. So they're really just having all kinds of troubles trying to find a path forward. And I don't see it happening in 26. Abbott's probably going to run for re-election. Dan Patrick said he's going to run for re-election. You've got probably Ken Paxton, who's going to run against John Cornyn in a primary. One of the two of them is going to win that race regardless. So I just don't see a kind of path where, unless something dramatic changes, that you're going to see Democrats doing very well statewide.
Well, I think we have to leave Texas politics, and when we come back, we'll talk presidential politics.
Want to keep up with KMU Studios? Join us on our socials. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads for exclusive content, station news, special previews of popular shows and podcasts, behind-the-scenes looks, and upcoming community events. Get social with us. Follow us on Facebook by searching KMU Public Broadcasting, or on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads at KMU TV FM.
I'm Marco Werman. The World's Newsroom brings you the big picture stories and some other stuff.
It may surprise you to learn, but in Italy, many mafiosi are religious.
You don't expect to find a swimming pool in the middle of the desert.
The rule number one when planning a golf course in China is to not call it a golf course.
Join us and hear the world.
Weekdays at 2 on Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU FM.
We're back with Brandon Rottinghaus from the University of Houston, and we talked Texas politics in the first half. We're ready to talk presidential politics. So one of the things you do that I think we both find really interesting is the Presidential Greatness Project. Can you tell us what makes a great president?
Well, I'll say this. It depends on the era. It depends on kind of when you ask. I will say that one thing that's interesting about talking about the notion of presidential greatness is that it does shift over the course of years. We've been doing this, my colleague Justin Vaughn and I, who's an A&M PhD, he's a good Aggie. We've been doing this for several years. We do the survey basically of academics who study the presidency, and we get the sort of results that estimate, kind of which presidents are considered great and which are considered less great. Ultimately, it's funny to see kind of the transition. So for instance, in 2015, when we did the survey, we found that people thought that greatness meant getting things done, like getting legislation passed and pursuing an agenda that was going to be workable. Now we're seeing in the last incarnation of the survey, kind of protection of democracy and respect for institutions is a big feature in terms of what makes great presidents. So I guess answering your question is a little hard to know because people change their estimations like the academic literature on this has a pretty clear indication, though, like over time of what they expect. So, for instance, if you win a war, you're a great president. If you have fewer scandals, you're a great president. If you have a good economy, you're a great president. If you're kind of intellectually considered to be smart, then you're a great president. So those are some of the characteristics that, like, over time, people have found like correlate highly with greatness. But there's more to it than that. And I think it's important to talk about this because presidents are so central to how we think about the political world that it's useful for us to understand kind of how they can manage these kinds of expectations. I think, if I had to guess, next time we do the survey, that we'll get a sense from the public or from the poll that, you know, kind of being a champion of the people is an important part of this. And that's something that fell out of favor in the kind of, you know, mid 1970s when the historians were asking it. But I think that that's become more of a kind of thrust for all politics, but especially at the presidential level.
Yeah. So how many examples do you have where, like, you know, where in retrospect somebody becomes greater than they were when we first started? And as you talked about, the kind of the change in the times actually changes the way we assess somebody.
Yeah, we see a fair amount of movement. You know, some people move up, some people move down. We did see kind of people like Jimmy Carter move up a little bit. I suspect since he's passed, we'll also see him move up. There were kind of multiple rounds of revision of his presidency and interest in his presidency. And so we did see him bump up a little bit from our first survey to our second survey. Bill Clinton is the same. His numbers have improved. We saw actually FDR increase in terms of the greatness measure. He was basically about number 4, sometimes number 5. And now in the most recent survey, he's at number 2. I should hasten to say that, you know, we're surveying academics who tend to be a little bit more left-leaning. So the Democratic presidents did much better in this last session or this last survey than we have seen in the past, probably as a result of the Donald Trump effect, right? They're basically bumping up all the Democrats because, you know, there's this sort of concern that Donald Trump is not respecting these institutional norms. And I don't know if we'll see that again, but like I said, I think we're likely to see the presidents that really champion the public to increase. So we have seen some of that movement, but we've also seen people go down. Andrew Jackson's a great example of that. You know, he was a president who, you know, was seen as a kind of prototypical American, right? He had the kind of, gusto to, pursue his agenda. He changed the notion of constitutional responsibilities in the presidency, but because of the kind of ideas that, you know, he had pursued kind of a race-based course on some of his policies, that, you know, it wasn't acceptable anymore. So when people reassess and reevaluate greatness, then that can hurt you too in the modern context.
Is there sort of, and I think maybe you were going in this direction, Todd, but I'm certainly thinking about it. Is there any there is no question he has ambition for greatness. There is no question when you watch what he's doing in the early part of this second Trump 2.0 administration that he is trying to get things done, and he's trying to remake government, and he's claiming executive power, all the sorts of things that, you know, if you think about, you know, who are the great presidents? Well, they expanded the office and they fundamentally changed the political landscape. He's making that play. If he's successful, do we, in 20 years, run the survey? If we can run the survey, are we going to run the survey and find that, well, wow, actually, he really was an influential president? And is influential the same as greatness?
Yeah, it's a great point. On the last question, whether influence is the same as greatness, you know, historians typically tied those things together. They would expressly tell their survey respondents that, you know, greatness means leaving the office more substantially powerful than you left it. We don't give any indication of what we think is greatness to our respondents. We just sort of let them tell us. We do then ask them verbatims about kind of what they think a great president is, which is why we can kind of get a sense of how that changes over time. But I do think that, you know, one aspect of greatness is about institutional capacity. But I think that you will see Donald Trump rise. Now, like you said, he's on the very bottom of this list. And the last two times we've done the survey, this was actually a debate point. In the first debate between Trump and Biden, they were each calling each other the worst president, and Biden brought the facts. He brought the receipts and said, like, well, look, there's this survey that does this.
Yeah. He even cited y'all specifically, right?
We're still digging out of that hate mail, but yeah, I do think that we'll see, and Justin is very much a proponent to suggest that we're likely to see Trump increase. And honestly, whether it's greatness means morality or greatness means respect for these norms or not, it's definitely the case that he's changed the American presidency more than almost any president in history. So by that standard, you have to say that he's on the mantle of greatness because he's shifted the way that we think about it. Now, if we had the same kind of polarization that we had in, now as we had, say, in, 1900 when Teddy Roosevelt, push these norms, would we have had the same kind of pushback on him? I don't know. I mean, that's not to compare the two, but to say that, the environment matters at least a little bit and how presidents are perceived in that world are. I mean, George Washington broke norms. Thomas Jefferson was able to shape the office in ways that would have been anathema to the framers. So every president has this capacity and they all are pushing the boundaries of their office. It's just a natural course of the growth of the institution. Donald Trump does it maybe in a more crude fashion and perhaps without like as much kind of reverence for those boundaries. But it definitely is the case that he's changed the office in ways that almost no other president has.
Brandon, every president that wins an election says that they have a mandate from the voters to do certain things. Richard Neustadt used to famously say that the power of the president is the power to persuade. So if we look at the presidency today, what is power for the president? What's Trump's power?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Neustadt's thinking was kind of conditioned on the idea that presidents could personally influence the way that government worked. That's still true to a high degree, but scholars have come along to suggest that this is just kind of one feature of the presidency, and the ways that they are able to leverage their institutional power is as important in terms of their ability to grow the office as persuading. And so I think Trump loves this, right? I mean, the reverence you see on his face when he's like signing these orders, there's just this like army of people who are handing him documents and he's like signing each one. That to him is power. Now, what Neustadt would say is that's not power, right? He would say that this is basically the absence of power, where if you have to command people to do things, then you've done it wrong. But the fact is that this is still a portion of how presidents govern. And executive orders, although limited in terms of scale and scope, are still substantial in terms of their impact. So not just that, institutionally speaking, but also just politically speaking, right? We are in a world, I'm sorry to say, where people may not have a real clear sense about kind of how presidents operate, what they do, and how these things function. And as much as we've done our job, I think, really well to articulate this and to talk to our students about it, there are still a lot of people who either forget that or don't understand kind of those specific dynamics. So there is a sense that maybe acting unilaterally is just acting. I'll put a plug in here for Kenny Lowendy's new book at Michigan, and he makes the case that basically presidents are just performance actors, right? They don't intend for these things to be policy, gravitas. They really just want to be able to get a photo and they want to be able to put it on social media and say, hey, look what I did. That to me is a really sad but compelling story about the modern presidency. So I think that's right. I mean, I don't think Neustadt is incorrect about this. I just think that, there's a lot of other ways that presidents have been successful at, promoting themselves and their institutional capacity.
Well, you may have sort of already answered this next question, but it does seem like, again, Trump always has these moments where you're like, what is he doing? I have to rethink how I thought about the world because he's doing things exactly the opposite of how I think a president should behave. And one of those is coming in, especially in the second term, and we talked about priorities and a clear set of priorities in terms of Texas politics, but in national politics as well, I expect the president to come in and have this very clear, well-defined set of priorities, this signature issue and understanding to put their and Trump is coming in, and you've heard the term chaos president, flooding the zone. He's throwing everything out at once, and it's all over the place, and it's frankly, I don't know how you feel. I don't know. I'm exhausted already. I'm like, has it not been a year already? It seems like it's, and you wonder in terms of a communication and in terms of a political standpoint, is this something that's going to take away from this is his play for greatness, doing lots of things, changing lots of things, but you also wonder, is he doing too much? Is his messaging all over the place? Are people going to be distracted from the things that he really needs them to care about? Or is he just rewriting the playbook for us?
That's a great question. I don't know that we know the answer to that. I'd love to look at the numbers and see if like the volume of legislative requests has any effect on perceptions of greatness. I think that the answer would be that people remember a handful of things about what a president does. And, history can sometimes, like boost those things up. Justin and I just did an op-ed at the LA Times where we make the case that, Biden's legacy when we did the survey was high. Like this was before the debate. It was before the pardon of his son. It was before, some of the last minute changes. So like as kind of observers of politics, we see, kind of where things were before that, and where things will be after that will be very different. I think we both think so. That's certainly the case. And the reason we get there, the logic is that, people remember presidents for not just sort of the things that they do, but also just the way that they approach the office. Like, are they doing things that are, kind of in scale? Are they able to kind of communicate these efforts effectively? Are they able to kind of side with the times and sort of flow with what's going on around them? And that's really a hard thing for them to do. And sometimes they have no control over it. So I do think, though, in this case that, Donald Trump has a lot of control over it. He doesn't have to do this in this rapidity of action. He could take a slower pace. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think he's got his eyes set on two things. The first is the first 100 days. This is a kind of arbitrary symbolic mark of the success presidents have, but it is a lagging indicator of kind of how they're going to be remembered, right? He wants to be FDR and not Bill Clinton. If you remember the first Clinton presidency, like the first 100 days were chaos. So that's one thing he's looking for. The other thing is I think he wants to be able to have something to brag about in early March when he addresses the joint session of Congress, and basically is going to make a case that, this is the most impressive display of presidential power we've seen since FDR, or maybe for him it'll be forever. But I mean, I think FDR is the natural comparison point. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of just a word salad of statements here without much conclusion. But I think you're onto something, which is that, maybe he's doing too much. And I think really pulling rein and being more disciplined is the way to go. There is a sense that would be the case, right? With Susie Wilkes as the chief of staff, there was an idea that, probably you're going to have a more structured White House. It probably is internally, but externally, it still feels chaotic.
Yeah, and it feels a little bit like he took the guardrails. The people who were there saying, no, this is the way you do it when you're president, they're not there anymore. And what the lesson that he took away is move quickly, go big.
Yeah.
Don't play around.
And definitely, if you look at, is there going to be Trump fatigue, among the public as we move forward? And I think it seems to me like they've determined we're going to go as fast as we can until we run out of something, support or energy, one of the two. So it'll be interesting. And also, I think there's also, because of the fact he made so many promises coming in, doesn't he have to, there has to be some successes, not just a policy win, but also you're going to see, our price is going to come down, or is he able to fulfill his promises on immigration, this type of thing? Or people are going to say, well, he's just like everybody else.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the short answer is maybe. I think that's correct. Where people will want to see that prices are better. They'll want to see that there's a sort of some kind of progress made towards solving the immigration problem. But at the same time, I'm also not sure what reality is anymore, right? Like if Donald Trump and his administration are saying, well, prices are coming down, look at this, and it's wrong. Or they're looking at the numbers of border crossings and they're saying, we're doing a good job, right? They reported negative border interactions, which is statistically impossible this last week. In reality, the numbers are kind of where they were for Obama. I don't know what the American public will believe, right? I mean, clearly his base will believe what he says, but will the kind of rank and file of just sort of everyday people who don't follow what he's saying every day, who are never on Twitter, who don't watch the news, but maybe like once a week, will look at this and say things are better or not? And how I assess that is kind of unknown. So we'll see. I think that's the real danger of this kind of post-truth world we live in, where, you know, what reality is shaped heavily by your partisanship. And that's a scary place to be.
Well, now, with that in mind, one of the things you've been writing about and you've been thinking a lot about is the idea of presidential, well, scandal more general. I was going to call it presidential scandal, but it seems like the world has changed in terms of how we respond to scandal, and that maybe do we even use the word scandal anymore? Or are scandals gone? Or is it just, oh, there was a thing that happened, it's not a scandal?
Can you even have a scandal anymore?
Yeah, should a scandal, to be a definitional scandal, should there be some impact on public opinion or some negative consequence? But anyway, are there scandals, or are they do they have the effect that they once did?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm currently negotiating with my editor on this book. I want to call the book "Do Scandals Still Matter?" He has a different idea because, you know, publishing and the way it's listed is sort of more technical, probably above my head. But that's the thrust of it, right? Whether scandals still matter. And the kind of reasoning we have is that polarization has taken root. People no longer trust the opposition parties to do the right thing. They no longer like them at all. And seeing them in danger is a positive thing for them. We don't have cross-partisan associations, friends, and that has a negative effect on the ability to see across the aisle and say, maybe there's something, you know, here we should really reassess. Media is siloed by partisanship, and so people don't even know sometimes that their politician who's preferred is in a scandal, or if they do know about it, it's shaded in such a way as to say that it's not important. Politicians use rhetoric to basically imply that this is an incorrect thing, that that's not a real scandal, that it's just a grievance the other side has because they're against you, but they're coming, you know, through me to get to you. That language is like textbook. So this is just a short list of the reasons that basically make scandals really hard to land. And I think that the reason it's important to note is that, you know, if we lose scandals, we lose to some degree accountability. Scandals are like a canary in the coal mine. They tell us if there's some kind of a problem, either a moral failing from that person, a legal issue that needs to be addressed, some kind of a financial crisis that is that can be fixed. This is what scandals do for us. Sometimes it's just noise and, you know, you move forward, and sometimes it's something that's more critical. So that's the real problem, I think, of losing scandals. The accountability that it brings is something that we lose as well.
Yeah, it certainly sounds that way. I mean, we have a president reelected or you could argue that there was many scandals, at least the discussion of scandals over that time, and also there were accusations against the Biden family that seemed to, you know, kind of not really go that far. So it's a very interesting time that we have, and it'll be interesting to see. Do you guys ask questions in your poll about scandals?
We do. Actually, for part of the book, I asked people questions about like how much a scandal influenced their belief about a presidential greatness. And only a couple of scandals did it matter. One was the Trump scandal, and the other was the Risky Ring scandal. So those are the two that really mattered, and it makes sense in some cases. Oh, and Watergate too. So, you know, it makes sense. These are institutional scandals. They're associated with some serious wrongdoing, and in cases, two of the cases that led to impeachment. So there is this kind of institutional norm that people want respected, and to some degree, it's not being respected. There's a lot of these kind of problems that are floating around, and you know, presidents are one piece of this. But in the book, I look at governors, I look at members members of Congress. And one of the things I find is that if you look at the kind of ways that scandals end careers or don't end careers, in the 1970s, if you were in Congress and you were confronted with a scandal, your shelf life was very short. You would resign or you would be ousted. Whereas now your longevity in office is more significant. I track this using basically kind of survival models. You can see when the scandal breaks and you can see when the scandal ends or when the person leaves office, either through election or by resignation. And one of the things you see is that in the more partisan period, members of Congress, governors, and presidents hang on for longer. So it's a partisan effect that is damaging to our system. And politicians know it. They can get away with stuff now that they never could have before. And that's scary too.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask quick. I was going to change the subject. You were going to ask this.
Oh, well, let me hit on the scandal part of it then, because one of the things that I'm super fascinated is this idea that you could, once upon a time, you would be contrite if you had a scandal and you would be, oh, I'm so sorry. And you might have your spouse next to you and you might go talk to a minister. And that was the way you tried to navigate the scandal and you tried to survive. And it seems like now the approach is didn't do it. Doesn't matter. Yeah. Or I did do it and they're wrong. It's not a big deal, or and with Trump especially, there was almost this sense that it helped him with his base. Maybe that it fed in. He always had the narrative of being aggrieved and being targeted, and so even though there was these scandals, it seemed like, oh no, this is what he prepared his base for this coming, and did a good job of sort of saying they're coming after me. Get ready.
Yeah, it's so true. In fact, looking at some of the details, you can see that when there are these allegations, members of Congress and presidential candidates actually increase the ability to raise money. Their base likes it. And the reason they like it is because the way the politicians frame it is to say that this is because of my, fighting for you, right? They're coming after us, but I'm just in the way. And that is a really strong argument for a base who is just looking for a reason to hate the other side. Yeah. There are some scandals which I think objectively are wrong. There are some scandals which objectively are meaningless, but it's hard to tell the difference when politicians treat them all the same. So yeah, I think you're exactly right that this sort of model for how one approaches this is very different. You think about Eliot Spitzer when he resigned as governor of New York. He had been to a prostitute. He came out and basically instantly said, mea culpa. I did it. Sorry. The wife was there, and basically resignation is imminent. Contrast that to somebody like Andrew Cuomo, who had two different scandals. One was about the production of information about the nursing home deaths during COVID. And the second was the sexual assault charges or sexual assault allegations from several members of his staff. He fought that for months before it ended up hurting him. And he's considering a comeback. Right? One of the things that's interesting is that I just charted kind of politicians who were in scandals and looked at, whether or not they were able to successfully come back or not. And basically about 25% of people who are involved in a scandal in the past and run for office again are successful. So the numbers aren't great, but that's better than you'd expect considering that these scandals had ended their career the first time. So, I was reading an article last week about Anthony Weiner, who's running for controller of the city of New York. He's run for mayor before after having left office in disgrace as a member of Congress, being caught on a dating app and sending lewd pictures of himself. So just these kinds of things are no longer, career enders the way they used to be.
Wow. One last question. We would expect Donald Trump to be a domestic president, to really want to focus on domestic issues. But sometimes history it changes things. George W. Bush example, 9/11 happened and he became an international, a foreign president. So going forward, it seems like what we read about Donald Trump now is all about international things every day. Yeah. And so is this strategic, or is it just happened that way and they're having to respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent some time last week at the Bush Library for a project that I've been doing. It's a collection of requests from members of Congress to the White House. I have data going back to Eisenhower. So basically now 70 years of data of requests of members of Congress of the president. And so I got the Bush data because I had my FOIA filled. So that was a fun day. This is what political scientists are excited about. Like the government came through with my Freedom of Information Act request. But yeah, looking at the documents there, you see a definite shift in terms of how Bush was treating legislation, right? Initially, of course, a lot of the letters are about domestic policy and kind of how they're going to pursue these various tax cuts. Then, of course, everything after 9/11 shifts to foreign policy and then Iraq. And so that change is very abrupt, and most presidents are unable to control that. I think if Donald Trump is lucky, he'll be able to set his own agenda. But like you say, sometimes those things are not able to happen. I think he's kind of playing with fire a little bit. This week, as of this recording, there's been a lot of discussion about what to do about the Middle East. He's implied that he would like to see the Gaza Strip taken over by the U.S. That's problematic on any number of levels, and the allies are saying this is wrong. Members of Congress are saying what? So that's the kind of shift that a president doesn't have to take. That might be an unforced error. So it's hard to say, kind of how it'll come out. But I do think that he's got to get some wins. And the base has so many demands that, and the Republican Party is so fragmented in terms of its interests and ideologies that he's got to satisfy so many different people that, he really has to pick his battles, I think, if he wants to be successful. Maybe he can tackle all of it. That's something that, presidents have the capacity to do. But at some point, they will run out of steam. And if that happens before he's able to accomplish some things, the midterms could look very bad for him.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for your time. This is a great conversation. We'd love to just keep going for forever, but we need to cut it off here. Todd, another great conversation. Yes. That's it for episode 21, and we're going to keep talking to y'all throughout 2025 about politics.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/insidepoliticalscience. Have a question for our experts? Email them at insidepolicy@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.